The heavy inertia dampeners screamed in protest as the ironclad executed a high G-vector shift, pulling the dreadnought sideways against the expected trajectory. Kalen Var felt the pressure compress his chest cavity, a familiar, brutal reminder that even in deep space, physics held dominion. The smell of hot plasma residue and ozone clung to the air filtration intake vents, laced with the sharp, stale scent of recycled sweat from the bridge crew. 3 seconds. 3 seconds remained until the coordinated plasma sweep from the surrounding Xylos-packed destroyers would intersect the position where the target vessel, the Solitis, was supposed to be, but the Solitis was not there. Kalen's hand slammed down on the emergency abort sequence for the barrage. The gesture was purely reflexive, a desperate attempt to halt an execution order he had already broadcast moments before the realization crystallized. On the main tactical display, the spectral signatures of the Allied mercenary hulls held their positions, waiting for the detonation countdown to resolve. The silence from the Solitis, however, was absolute, defying the orbital mechanics of their current engagement. Impact vector calculated to intersect 0.01 standard deviations from projected target lock, reported Andril War, the navigation specialist, his voice strained, betraying the sudden spike in adrenaline. Andril was young, competent, but lacked the corrosive cynicism Kalen had spent decades cultivating. Abort confirmed, Andril. Reroute all forward energy to point defense matrices. Prepare for close quarters engagement protocols. Status report on external sensor integrity. Kalen's voice was low, pitched just above the operational hum of the ironclad's reactor core. He ignored the throbbing in his jaw, a physical manifestation of suppressed fury and the deep systemic betrayal he was currently enduring. He had chased the Solitis for 7 standard cycles, pouring the remaining solvency of the Aegis Pact into this venture only to be used as a demolition charge by the Pact admirals who had guaranteed safe passage through Xylos territory. They hadn't wanted the Solitis captured. They wanted it destroyed and Kalen's fleet to take the liability heat. Lyra, positioned at tactical analysis, didn't look up from her illuminated panel. The faint, acrid scent of overheated circuitry often followed her intense focus. Captain, the Pact fleet is showing significant thrust adjustments. They are attempting to re-establish firing solutions. They believe we missed. They know we missed, Kalen corrected, staring at the empty coordinates shimmering on the tactical display. The Solitis had vanished precisely at the moment the Pact ships initiated their coordinated fire solution, a perfect, impossible evasion. They were never intending for us to recover anything. They engineered this engagement to look like a mercenary failure, clearing the sector for their own follow-up salvage team, or perhaps just eliminating a persistent nuisance. He felt the familiar, bitter burn of being pawned, a fate common to those who operate outside the rigid structures of the unified stellar charter. Kalen had seen too many honest veterans discarded, too many hard-won victories sanitized by political maneuvering, leaving only the wreckage and the dead. This hunt for the Solitis, a ship rumored to hold pre-collapse technology capable of independent system-wide cloaking, was his last throw for true autonomy. War, hail the Pact flagship, designated Oculus Prime. Use the high-frequency denial channel. Inform them that the Solitis has engaged and destroyed itself under independent drive failure. Note, we recovered 0 data cores and only trace hull fragments. insufficient for claim filing, stress the systemic failure. Andrel hesitated, the digital display reflecting the turmoil in his wide eyes. "Captain, that's a formal declaration of mission failure, sir. The Covenant will freeze all accrued performance bonds." "I am aware of the financial implications, Andrel. What I am not aware of is the disposition of the vessel that deliberately vectored away from our fire zone while we were being used as cover. Inform them that if they push the issue of our competence, we will release the encrypted telemetry logs, showing their synchronized targeting parameters, the ones they swore were only for defensive calibration." Kalen leaned forward, the harsh light catching the tension lines around his mouth. This was the price of defiance, calculated risk based on deep-seated cynicism. The bridge fell into a tense quiet, broken only by the low, thrumming vibration transmitted through the deck plates, the sound of massive power generation battling the cold vacuum. The packed ships, sensing Kalen's sudden shift from predator to political liability, paused their maneuvering. Lyra finally spoke, her voice cutting through the operational hum. "Captain, new contact signatures developing at the extreme perimeter. Non-charter identification matrices, fast movers. Too fast for standard scout-class pursuit." They were running silent, waiting for the packed engagement to conclude. Kalen felt the cold sensation return, deeper this time. The Solitus hadn't fled. It had drawn them out, baited the mercenaries into a trap, allowing the real predators to position themselves outside the expected combat perimeter. The packed fleet was an unwitting shield for the unknown entity, now closing in. "Who are they?" Kalen demanded, his mind racing past immediate survival tactics toward strategic analysis. This wasn't standard piracy. This was orchestrated, layered deception. "Unknown. Hull composition suggests heavy shielding, but their drive signatures, they are anomalous, Captain, almost non-existent until they initiated acceleration burns within the last 10 seconds. It is the signature of the Solitus K, but amplified, weaponized." Lyra's fingers danced across her board, her usual pragmatic assessment morphing into something bordering on dread. "Sir, the vessels, there are 3, are broadcasting a single encrypted frequency. It is not a challenge. It is a decryption key." Kalen stared at the screen, where 3 needle-thin, impossibly dark shapes were resolving against the distant purple haze of the gas giant. They possessed none of the hard angles or functional bulk of human design. They were fluid, elegant, and utterly alien. "Andrel, attempt to resolve the key. Do not reply. Focus everything on counter-encryption." The ship's processors strained, the low internal whirring of the main computer rising in pitch. The scent of burning plastic, faintly electrical, now permeated the air near the primary consoles. After what felt like an epoch, Andrel swallowed hard, the dry sound amplified by the sudden tension. "Captain, the key resolves. It's a single string of standardized galactic dialect. A directive." Kalen braced himself, expecting a demand for surrender or perhaps the standard charter ultimatum regarding contraband. He had prepared speeches for both. "Read it, War." Andrel took a shuddering breath, his composure finally fracturing under the weight of the unexpected. It reads, "The quarantine perimeter is established. You have violated the sanctity of the long sleep. Cease all unauthorized proximity immediately, or face systemic erasure for the Tharnak ascendancy." The name Tharnak was myth, a deep history threat whispered only in the most secure archives, an older civilization rumored to have achieved a form of biological stasis that spanned galactic epochs, capable of rendering entire sectors sterile if their slumber was disturbed. They were not a rival corporation or a hostile military. They were custodians of a cosmic graveyard, and Kalen Var, hunting ancient gold, had just woken them up. Kalen looked back at the spectral image of the Solidus, now truly visible as the packed ships frantically pulled back from the coordinates. It wasn't an empty prize. It was a beacon, a tripwire, a tombstone marking the boundary of a forbidden domain. And now, three impossibly fast, silent entities, representatives of a force that viewed humanity as negligible background noise, were bearing down on the ironclad. "Lyra," Kalen said, the word raspy, his throat suddenly tight with the dry dust of absolute realization. "Damage report on the primary shield emitters following that emergency shift, and tell the boarding party to abort immediately. We are not salvaging treasure. We are attempting to escape a planetary quarantine zone enforced by something that doesn't recognize our right to exist." The cold dread had solidified into a singular diamond-hard point of purpose: survival against an existential indifference. The silence outside was no longer a mystery. It was the sound of judgment being passed. The sudden intrusion of the Tharnak directive choked the usual ambient noise of the ironclad's bridge into a suffocating near silence. The internal air scrubbers strained against the influx of stale, recycled breath, doing little to clear the metallic tang of fear now laced through the environment. Kalen watched the spectral projection of the three alien vessels, their dark forms moving with an unnatural, frictionless grace that mocked established principles of thrust efficiency. He pressed his fingertips against the cool ridge of the command console, the faint vibration beneath his skin, doing nothing to ground the sudden dizzying sense of cosmic insignificance. Lyra's response was immediate, stripped bare of conjecture. "Shield emitters reading at 67% effective output, Captain. The emergency maneuver stressed the cascade regulators beyond recommended tolerance. Minor hull breaches detected on decks 7 through 9. Localized venting." Her eyes flicked up from the damage assessment, holding Kalen's gaze with grim acknowledgement. "The packed fleet is scattering, Captain. They recognize the signature, or at least the danger associated with it. They are abandoning us to the quarantine." Kalen nodded once, a jerky, almost involuntary motion. Abandonment was expected. Loyalty in the mercenary sector was a commodity purchased only for the duration of the contract, and this contract was now voided by beings who operated on epochs, not credits. He remembered his grandfather, a grizzled miner who'd lost his claim on a volatile asteroid belt to a sudden charter mandate citing historical planetary significance. The memory surfaced unbidden. The smell of silicate dust in the cramped habitation module, the way his grandfather had methodically disassembled his kinetic rifle rather than surrender it to the bureaucratic surveyors. That same quiet refusal to yield something earned through sheer effort was what Kalen needed now. War. Forget the pact. Reroute all non-essential power from auxiliary life support to main drive core acceleration buffers. We need maximal thrust capability on my mark. I want a micro-jump solution plotted immediately for the nearest unclaimed sector, somewhere off the standard navigation mesh, anywhere The Tharnock designation doesn't apply. Andrel's hands flew across the console, his previous terror now transmuted into frantic, necessary action. Calculating jump solutions, Captain. Estimating required navigational calibration time. 35 seconds. Minimum. The Tharnock proximity is interfering with the primary triangulation arrays. 35 seconds was a death sentence when facing vessels that moved like light itself. The Tharnock ships were not engaging yet. They were maneuvering into a formation, establishing a perimeter that was simultaneously closing the gap and projecting an invisible boundary. This was not a rush to battle. It was the methodical tightening of a snare. They were treating the ironclad like a contaminated object needing containment before disposal. Lyra leaned closer to the console, her voice dropping to a near whisper, designed not to carry across the bridge, but to transmit intimacy in the face of overwhelming odds. Captain, if that directive is accurate, the Solitus was not a treasure ship. It was an archival containment unit, perhaps carrying the genetic code or the philosophical residue of the civilization the Tharnock are protecting. By breaching it, we didn't just steal, we contaminated their archive. The realization landed with the weight of a collapsing star. All the hardship, the debt, the relentless striving for self-determination, all reduced to the reckless curiosity of a scavenger disturbing something ancient and profoundly dangerous. Kalen felt a sudden sickening surge of nausea, the ghost of the ancient loneliness he glimpsed reflected in the solidus sphere now twisting his gut. He thought of Mariel Ward, the xenolinguist he'd left behind on Port Sigma 2 cycles ago, promising her a secure future upon his return from this final run. That future was now as distant and irrelevant as the pre-collapse era. Captain, the Tharnock vessels are beginning primary weapons spool up, Lyra warned, the data overlay on her screen showing energy signatures blooming along the alien hulls. Not plasma, not kinetic, but something that pulsed with that same oppressive azure light from the Solidus core. They are charging what appear to be localized field disruption emitters. If those hit us, the primary drive core will revert to cold state containment immediately. We won't just stop, we'll lock up entirely. War. Calibration time? Kalen snapped. 28 seconds, Captain. The interference is growing. Kalen looked at the tactical display. The pack ships were far enough away now to be irrelevant, tiny flecks of human conflict swallowed by the looming galactic threat. The ironclad was pinned between the Tharnock containment field deployment and the immense gravitational presence of the nameless gas giant, which offered no sanctuary, only a larger obstacle. He slammed his fist onto the console, not in rage, but to finalize the calculus of desperation. The risk of a short, blind jump into the unknown was preferable to the absolute certainty of systemic erasure within the next 30 seconds. Lyra, prepare evasive countermeasures, all decoys, all non-lethal chaff. Deploy in a tight spiral away from the planned jump vector. Make them look like a critical systems failure. Andrel, when you have the solution, execute immediately. Do not wait for final confirmation. Inject emergency override command Delta 990 directly into the drive ignition sequence to bypass the standard safety checks. Sir, Delta 990 bypasses the inertial stabilizers completely, Andrel protested, his voice cracking. The G-forces will crush anyone not in a reinforced stabilization cradle. Then I suggest everyone strap in tighter than they have ever strapped in before, Kalen ground out. He reached for the nearest support strut, his knuckles white as the ironclad shuddered under the rising strain of redirected power. The bridge lights flickered violently, plunging the command center into momentary darkness before the auxiliary lighting snapped on, bathing the strained faces of his crew in a sickly amber glow. The alien energy emissions intensified on the screen. The azure light was now staining the surrounding vacuum near the advancing Tharnak ships. Kalen could feel the thrum of his own ship turning into a high-pitched whine, the sound of metal screaming under unsustainable stress. 10 seconds to full charge on the emitters, Lyra reported, her voice now a tight wire of control. 9, 8. Andrel began counting, his focus locked solely on the rapidly resolving navigational solution. Kalen closed his eyes for the briefest second, tasting the stale metallic air. He had gambled everything on the Solidus being a forgotten prize, and instead it was the trigger for a reckoning against forces that saw humanity as merely invasive mold upon a vast, sleeping structure. He opened his eyes just as the primary drive engaged, not with a smooth surge, but with a violent, agonizing lurch that seemed to tear the very fabric of the ship apart around them. "Jump initiated! Hold tight!" Andrel screamed just before the bridge was consumed by a chaotic flash of displaced light and the catastrophic, bone-jarring shockwave of a maneuver executed without the benefit of stabilizing physics. The last sensation Kalen registered before the blackness of transit enveloped him was the sound of alarms fusing into a single, distorted scream of overloaded circuitry, a sound that mirrored the internal tearing of his own failing grip on reality. The transition was not the clean geometric snap of a controlled micro-jump. It was the ragged, tearing sound of a sheet of stressed titanium being ripped apart in slow motion. Kalen's world snapped back into agonizing high-fidelity existence, not with light, but with overwhelming pressure. The air in the bridge, already thin from the power drain, was suddenly thick with the stench of burning insulation mixed with the sharp, coppery odor of fresh internal hemorrhaging. For a full, suspended second, Kalen could only hear the wet, desperate gasp escaping his own lungs. The tactical displays were dead, replaced by chaotic streams of error codes overlaid on a backdrop of violent, randomized nebular distortion. The command console groaned under his grip, one side buckling inward where the main inertial dampeners had clearly failed to compensate for the G-spike. Andrel Wauer was slumped forward, his harness cutting deep trenches into his shoulders. A thin trickle of dark, viscous fluid running from his nose and pooling on the console rim. He was alive, barely conscious, his survival a testament to the cheap, over-engineered webbing Kalen had insisted upon for all bridge personnel, a vestige of his pre-mercenary fleet discipline. Lyra was still upright, held rigid by her harness, but her right arm was locked at an unnatural angle across her controls, the movement having clearly dislocated the shoulder joint. Her face was pale, sweat plastered to her temples, yet her eyes, wide and unfocused for a moment, snapped back to Kalen with ferocious calculation. "Report," Kalen managed, his own voice a shredded whisper, the residual acceleration shock vibrating in his teeth. He cautiously tested his left leg, intact, but screaming in protest. Lyra ignored the structural damage indicators blinking red across the auxiliary monitors. "We are clear of the gas giant's gravitational influence, Captain. Jump successful, though trajectory erratic. We overshot the calculated safe zone by a factor of 3.7 standard deviations. We are in uncharted cold space, no navigational markers, no charted stellar bodies within scanning range. Distance from the Tharnock engagement, significant, I estimate. The failure of the jump solution was not absolute. It was merely catastrophic. They were alive but utterly adrift, blind, and wounded. Power levels, Kalen demanded, forcing himself to stand, the movement sending spikes of agony through his lower torso. "Reserve core stabilizing," Lyra grit out, flexing her good hand. "Main drive is offline. Catastrophic failure of the plasma feed regulation unit during the transition. It's fused solid. We have life support for perhaps 48 hours at current consumption rates if we implement Level 3 power conservation immediately. We are effectively dead in the water, Captain, and we burned through every emergency fuel reserve, diverting power to that jump. The scent of burning insulation intensified, now mingling with the acrid smell of superheated lubricant dripping from the ceiling conduits. The silence outside the hull was absolute. The cold vacuum of unknown space, a heavy blanket wrapping around their fragile sanctuary. They had evaded immediate destruction by throwing themselves into a deeper, slower form of death. Kalen moved to war first, carefully releasing the navigation specialist from his harness. He checked the pulse, weak but present, and then gently positioned him in the emergency medical cradle adjacent to the tactical station. The sheer exhaustion of the effort made Kalen sway, his vision momentarily tunneling. This was the reality of warfare beyond the lines of any established charter. The enemy didn't have to hit you. They only needed to force you into making a mistake that physics would exploit. He turned back to Lyra, noting the faint bluish sheen beginning to creep along the edge of her visor, a sign of localized oxygen deprivation in her helmet seal, an indicator of deeper system failures spreading from the impact site. "Lyra, we need communication relay integrity. Can you bring the emergency low-band transceiver online? Patch it through the secondary bus if the primary is melted." "Trying, Captain. If the primary bus is fried, the low-band transmitter only has enough effective range to broadcast a few hundred kilometers. Useless for rescue, only good for tactical denial." Tactical denial. Kalen understood. If the Tharnock tracked them, they wouldn't risk broadcasting a full response detailing their presence. A silent, short-burst ping meant nothing to the vast, ancient intelligence they had disturbed. Kalen felt a cold bead of sweat trace a path down his spine, freezing instantly on contact with the clammy back of his uniform shirt. He needed to perform triage on the engineering section, but he couldn't leave the bridge unsecured. He needed manpower, and war was incapacitated. "Lyra, listen carefully. You monitor Andrel. Keep him stable. If the Tharnock signature reappears on passive sensors, fire the remaining chaff manually, regardless of remaining shield integrity. Do not attempt communication. I am descending to engineering via the maintenance access shaft. I need to see the drive core damage personally." Lyra's one good eye narrowed. "Captain, you are exhibiting signs of massive G-force trauma. You should be in stasis immediately. If you go down there, the heat exchange manifolds are likely compromised. You'll be breathing recycled fumes before the primary scrubbers fail completely." "We are not negotiating our end, Lyra," Kalen stated, the fatigue sharpening his tone into brittle command. "We lost the prize, we lost the leverage, and now we are running on borrowed time. I refuse to die waiting for the air recycling to expire. If we are to perish, it will be while attempting to impose one final localized act of defiance. Get the low-band transmitter ready to cycle for 3 seconds on my mark. He moved to the deck plating, finding the manual release for the engineering shaft cover. The smell emanating from the opening was foul, not just burnt metal, but something chemical, slightly organic, the signature of stressed biocircuitry reacting poorly to electrical overload. As he lowered himself onto the magnetic safety ladder, the faint, high-pitched whine that had accompanied the jump seemed to resonate again, not from the hull, but from within the ship's own strained bulkheads. The descent was a crawl through a vertical obstacle course of hanging, sparking conduits. When Kalen dropped the last meter onto the maintenance gantry, the temperature hit him like a physical blow, dry, oppressive heat that immediately began evaporating the residual moisture on his skin. The engineering bay was a nightmare of fractured insulation and molten alloys. The main drive containment field was clearly ruptured, venting superheated coolant vapor that condensed into fine, corrosive mist. He reached the primary regulator housing. It was fused, glowing a dull, angry red beneath the wreckage of its external plating. The metal felt spongy under his gloved hand. This was beyond field repair. This needed a complete replacement of the primary induction coil, a job that would take a fully staffed team 3 standard rotations under optimal conditions. Alone, it was impossible. Kalen activated his suit's thermal scanner. He scanned the area, searching for a viable backup or a salvageable component. The scanner highlighted a secondary induction ballast unit, a decommissioned piece of older drive hardware they had kept bolted into the aft cavity, intended for scrap but never removed. It was crude, inefficient, and required manual calibration, but it possessed sufficient power coupling to attempt a one-shot, low-power ignition, enough for a brief thruster burn, perhaps to nudge them into the path of a viable patrol lane, or at least aim them toward the nearest predicted energy source. As he began the arduous process of unbolting the ballast unit, fighting against fused metal and warped structural supports, he received a transmission from the bridge, relayed directly to his helmet comms, bypassing the main bridge speakers. Lyra's voice, strained but clear. "Captain, passive sensors just pinged. 2 contacts, small, fast. Not the Tharnock signature, but definitely utilizing deep-spectrum propulsion drives. They are approaching our position. They are not broadcasting hailing protocols. They are running silent, Captain." The exhaustion Kalen had been holding at bay clawed at his control. New contacts, not the massive, overwhelming threat of the Tharnock, but smaller, stealthier hunters drawn by the energy signature of their failed jump, the equivalent of blood in the water. He had traded the wrath of gods for the jaws of scavengers. What is their trajectory relative to us? Kalen grunted, wrenching the heavy ballast unit free, the sharp grating sound echoing horribly in the damaged bay. Closing fast. They are not slowing down to scan. They are coming in for an immediate boarding action, Captain. Standard pirate profiles, high kinetic weapons loadout, fast interceptors. They smell weakness. Kalen stared at the massive, inert ballast unit in his hands, then at the shattered main drive housing. He could not get the replacement unit online and wired into the auxiliary systems in time to prime a jump or even power the primary weapon emplacements. He had maybe 60 seconds before those interceptors were close enough to achieve lock-on. His gaze fell upon the emergency plasma torch, a tool designed for cutting through thick hull sections during salvage, capable of delivering a short, focused burst of extreme thermal energy. It was not a weapon, but in his hands, in this claustrophobic engine room, it was the only deterrent he possessed. The dilemma crystallized with painful clarity. He could spend the next 40 seconds attempting the impossible wiring of the salvaged ballast, hoping for a micro-thrust boost, but guaranteeing his immediate vaporization by the incoming raiders. Or he could utilize the plasma torch to melt the primary access hatches closed, sealing himself and the essential engineering core in a pressurized coffin, giving Lyra and War a slim chance to jury-rig the low-band emergency beacon without the threat of immediate boarding. Sealing himself in meant sacrificing his only chance at propulsion, but it might buy them the few extra hours of life support needed for a miracle. Kalen felt the familiar icy calm of fatalistic acceptance settle over him. He couldn't trust physics anymore. He had to trust entropy. Lyra, override my last order regarding the beacon cycle. Prepare for full non-evasive shutdown on all non-essential systems. I am initiating lockdown sequence on engineering section Beta 4. Do not attempt to override the bulkheads. Seal yourselves off. Conserve the air. Captain, you will be trapped, Lyra shouted, the control of her voice faltering for the first time since the engagement began. The pressure seals will engage automatically on your command. You will have no oxygen reserve. Kalen ignored the warning, bringing the heavy plasma torch to bear on the thick emergency door mechanism. The two closing alien contact signatures were visible on his suit's external display now. Two tiny, hostile icons moving inexorably toward the ironclad. "Tell Marielle Ward," Kalen whispered, the sound lost in the sudden roaring hiss as he ignited the torch, bathing the engine room in blinding, white-hot energy, that the hunt was always the only thing that mattered. He plunged the torch into the interlocking seals of the primary exit hatch, the sound of vaporized composite metal screaming in protest, sealing his fate just as the first kinetic impact from the approaching scavengers jarred the ironclad like a punch from a colossal fist. The secondary impact hammered the ironclad, not with the colossal force of a dreadnought exchange, but with the sharp, concussive spike of close-range kinetic penetration. Kalen, halfway through fusing the locking mechanism on the engineering bulkhead, felt the vibration travel up the torch handle, rattling his bones. The raw, white light of the torch sputtered as the localized power grid reacted violently to the external trauma, plunging the engine room into momentary thick blackness punctuated only by the emergency red strobes. When the lights returned, sputtering weakly, Kalen saw the impact zones on his external monitors. Two precise localized detonations near the port midsection, exactly where the scavengers would be attempting atmospheric breach. They hadn't wasted time hailing or demanding collateral. They were applying brute force extraction, treating the crippled vessel as inert salvage. He slammed the plasma torch one last time against the final locking pin, forcing the seal mechanism past its safety tolerances. A final, agonizing groan resonated through the gantry as the heavy locking plates engaged, soundproofed against the chaos brewing on the bridge above. The pressure equalization cycle began immediately, a sickening pneumatic hiss, indicating that Lyra and Waller were now isolated. their compartment running on independent reserves. Kalen was alone in the rapidly heating tomb of the drive core. The oppressive heat in Engineering Beta 4 was now absolute, a sterile, dry furnace fueled by residual core radiation and compromised cooling. The air, already thin, grew dense with the sharp chemical smell of vaporized wiring insulation, the scent of terminal decay. Kalen dropped the torch, its energy cell immediately failing under the stress, and turned toward the salvaged induction ballast unit. It was massive, dense, and required precise interface with the auxiliary conduits, a task that demanded absolute focus, something the adrenaline surge now rendered difficult. He leaned against the cold, massive housing of the inert primary drive, seeking momentary respite from the suffocating warmth. This was the true midpoint, the moment where the grand objective, wealth, autonomy, dissolved into the petty mechanics of immediate, localized survival. He had traded the macro war against the Tharnok for the micro war against opportunistic pirates, and in doing so, had sacrificed his ability to influence the outcome for his crew. Kalen forced his focus onto the ballast unit. He didn't need full power. He needed one precise, violent thrust, enough to alter their drift trajectory by a minuscule degree, hopefully into the path of some legitimate, non-xenophobic sector patrol within the next few solar cycles. He worked with brutal economy, stripping protective sheathing from the auxiliary conduit cables with a salvaged cutting tool, his movements jerky, driven by the ticking clock of the bridge's failing life support, while connecting the final power shunt, a thick, braided cable requiring 2 hands and total stillness. Kalen felt a strange, low-frequency resonance penetrate the hull. It was not the hard kinetic impact of the boarding parties. This was deeper, structural, a vibration that felt less like an attack and more like a geological survey. He paused, the conduit dangling inches from the coupling point. He accessed his suit's localized internal diagnostic relay, overriding Lyra's command to ignore external sensor readings, pull in what little residual data the local processors could still gather. The readings were baffling. The 2 small interceptor signatures were still present, positioned near the port breaches, but they were now stationary, inert. Worse, their faint internal energy signatures, the messy, volatile signatures of pirate combustion drives and life support, had vanished. They were dead, not from return fire, but from an external application of overwhelming, precise energy. Kalen initiated a wider spectrum passive scan, pushing the limited suit hardware past its recommended thresholds. The resulting display was a wash of static, then a single, agonizingly slow resolution of data points. The Tharnok. They had not left. They had simply stopped using aggressive maneuvers and switched to what Kalen's grandfather used to call surgical sterility. The Tharnok were not engaging the pirates. They were cleaning up the contamination. The 2 pirate vessels, having breached the hull and potentially introduced foreign biological elements, were being neutralized with focused energy pulses, not to defend against them, but to prevent the ironclad from becoming a vector for something else. The realization struck Kalen with the chilling force of a philosophical truth. The Tharnok did not view humanity as an enemy to be conquered, but as an infection to be quarantined. His decision to seal off engineering was not an act of sacrifice for Lyra. It was Kalen isolating himself as the primary source of contagion, the one who had physically touched the Solitus relic. This new data brought a profound, disturbing clarity. The Solitus wasn't a treasure cache. It was a preserved biological seed bank, a record of something the Tharnock desperately wanted to keep undisturbed. And Kalen, driven by greed, had smeared the residue of that ancient vault across his own hull. If the pirates were being erased for simply touching the ship, Kalen, the one who had entered the core chamber and handled the artifact, was now the object of ultimate scrutiny. He looked at the dangling power conduit in his hand. He had seconds to react before the Tharnock, having sanitized the breaches, began their primary scan of the interior structure to neutralize the remaining contaminant vector, himself. The dilemma was now stark and absolute. If he finished wiring the ballast unit, he could, perhaps, propel the ironclad slightly off its current dead trajectory, giving Lyra and War a minimal chance of drifting near a charted path. But the firing of the thrusters, even a low-power burn, would generate a detectable energy wake, instantly pinpointing his exact location within the ship for the Tharnock analytical sweep. He would condemn them by saving himself a few more hours of life. The alternative? Abandon the ballast, manually override the internal engineering section atmosphere scrubbers, and vent all remaining breathable air into the main vacuum of space. This would ensure Lyra and War's immediate demise, but the sudden, massive drop in internal pressure across the hull, coupled with the failure of all internal electrical systems, might momentarily mask his thermal signature long enough for the ironclad to become nothing more than inert, drifting debris, hopefully passing below the Tharnock's immediate threshold for active monitoring. He would die in the heat of the engine room, but he would deny the ancient custodians the satisfaction of a controlled execution. Kalen looked at the fused primary regulator, then at the crude connection point for the auxiliary ballast. It was a gamble against oblivion, betting that utter inertness was safer than even a flicker of resistance. He dropped the conduit. The heavy metal clattered uselessly onto the deck plating, the sound muffled by the rising ambient temperature. He did not look back toward the sealed bulkhead leading to the bridge. He reached for the manual atmospheric dump controls located near the main coolant recycler, a reinforced panel designed to jettison toxic gas, now repurposed. His fingers hovered over the sequence, 3 distinct sequential pressure releases required to guarantee a full, rapid decompression of the entire forward section, effectively scrubbing all signs of active life or volatile power signatures. It was an act of ultimate dereliction, the final execution of his crew, trading their immediate chance at rescue for the statistical probability of making their wreckage less interesting to the indifferent gods hunting them. He pressed the first release toggle. A deep, mechanical thunk echoed as the primary vent locks disengaged. The roar of escaping atmosphere was immediate, a violent, hungry sound that sucked the heat and the air from the engine room in a single, terrifying exhalation. Kalen felt the pressure drop across his suit almost instantly. The external sensors, still running on minimal internal battery, registered the event, a catastrophic, non-volitional loss of atmospheric containment across the central mass of the vessel. He pressed the second toggle. The ship groaned in protest, the metallic sound distorted by the vacuum now rushing through the internal decks. He closed his eyes, picturing Lyra's calculated gaze, War's youthful panic, and the distant, idealized image of Marielle. He had failed them not in battle, but in judgment. He had brought them to the edge of the abyss, and now he was ensuring they fell together. The third, final toggle engaged. The ironclad shuddered one last, massive time as the last vestiges of its internal atmosphere were violently ejected into the deep, cold void. Kalen felt the pressure equalization across his suit struggle against the impossible drain, the air in his helmet growing thin and stale, carrying only the ghost of the synthetic filtration. For a long, agonizing moment, there was nothing but the scream of escaping air. Then, the external sensors, operating purely on inertial readings, registered a shift. Not from the pirates, who were already gone. The Tharnak analytical sweep had arrived. It was not a focused beam, but a vast, slow-moving wave of ultra-low frequency energy encompassing the entire volume of the dead mercenary ship. And within that cold, probing energy wave, Kalen detected something new, something far more terrifying than the quarantine directive. Embedded within the Tharnak energy signature was a faint, rhythmic pulse, a beacon designed to attract something else. The Tharnak weren't just cleaning up a spill, they were signaling a rendezvous. They had deliberately left the Solitus vulnerability exposed, knowing it would draw attention from something even they treated with wary caution. Kalen had stumbled not upon an archive, but bait, and the signal was now broadcasting their location to the entity the Tharnak had been attempting to keep asleep. The final, massive shudder of the ironclad ceased, replaced by a silence so profound it felt manufactured, a deliberate suppression of all background radiation. Kalen, standing in the rapidly chilling engine compartment, registered the absolute lack of any internal noise save for the faint, rhythmic hiss of his suit's emergency life support struggling against the vacuum creeping through compromised seals. The pressure gauge on his wrist display had flatlined, yet the suit held, a testament to outdated, robust manufacturing standards that predated efficient disposable technology. He was encased in a tomb that was momentarily pressurized, a single heartbeat in a vast, dead machine. He opened his eyes, the visor reflecting the dull, residual warmth emanating from the fused primary drive housing. The heat was leaching away, replaced by a pervasive metallic cold that sank through the layers of his tactical gear, settling deep within his joints. This was not the clean cold of vacuum, but the heavy, exhausted chill of a system that had finally run out of energy to even warm its own corpse. The Tharnak signal, the rhythmic pulse embedded within their analytical sweep, was still there, faint, insistent, like a drumbeat in the crushing darkness of deep space. Kalen understood the mechanics of his failure. His greed had not just disturbed a secret, it had triggered a complex, multi-layered defensive protocol. The Tharnak had used the mercenaries, then the pirates, as disposable buffers, and now they were utilizing the resulting chaos to broadcast an invitation to an unknown, more powerful third party. He was the sacrificial lamb left on the altar to lure the true apex predator. He attempted to access the bridge comms again, overriding the lockdown protocols that Lyra had initiated. The connection was dead, the circuitry burned out by the massive power fluctuations during the jump and the subsequent depressurization. Lyra and War were entombed in their separate sections. The bulkhead, a permanent barrier of fused metal, the weight of that final desperate isolation settled upon him, heavier than any G-force. He had sealed them away for their minimal survival chance, a final, arrogant tactical decision made under duress, and now he had simultaneously ensured his own death and likely theirs, all in a futile attempt to mask his location. There was no honor in this failure, only consequence. He hadn't succumbed to a grand tactical maneuver. He had been undone by a slow mechanical bleed, a consequence of burning too hot for too long. Kalen Var, the captain who prided himself on reading the political currents and exploiting institutional weakness, had been blindsided by something operating on a scale where human greed was simply irrelevant interference. He staggered toward the engineering console, his movements clumsy, the suit's minimal auxiliary power reserves barely managing his joints. He needed data, any data, on what the Tharnak were calling for. His survival was immaterial. The crew's final moments deserved the dignity of knowing the scope of the threat they had encountered. He managed to boot the isolated diagnostic repeater, a system designed for logging catastrophic failure, not outbound communication. The data stream was agonizingly slow, but eventually the spectral analysis of the Tharnak beacon resolved into a recognizable pattern. It was not a language, nor an encryption key, but a gravitational signature overlay, a specific, complex frequency designed to resonate only with vessels possessing a particular ancient form of warp field generation. This confirmed his worst suspicion. The Tharnak were not masters of the galaxy. They were wardens, keeping something imprisoned or asleep, and the Solitus was the key to its cage. His reckless curiosity had not unlocked a treasure vault. It had accidentally sounded the alarm on a cosmic prison break. As the diagnostic repeater finally stabilized enough to display the signature clearly, Kalen noticed a hairline fracture spiderwebbing across the internal plating of the console screen itself, a consequence of the pirate impact. Beneath the fracture, a faint, almost imperceptible flicker of light. It wasn't the red of emergency lighting, nor the azure of the Tharnak energy field. It was the weak, intermittent glow of an unregistered auxiliary transmitter, one he had forgotten existed, a black market panic button installed years ago, designed to piggyback on the lowest frequency stellar drift monitors, broadcasting a minimal coded distress signal far outside standard charter recognition channels. It was a system so rudimentary, so low-powered, that the Tharnak analytical sweep, focused on high-energy signatures and complex gravitational harmonics, had entirely overlooked it. The signal was transmitting silently toward a known region of deep space smuggling and forgotten colonies, a region considered too volatile and lawless for any major power to monitor closely. It was a long shot, a whisper into a storm, requiring rescue by those as morally compromised as he was. It was the only option that offered anything other than immediate, silent erasure. The decision was instantaneous, born not of hope, but of a final desperate defiance against the indifferent order of the cosmos represented by the Tharnak. He could not save his ship, and he had already sacrificed his crew's immediate chances, but perhaps, just perhaps, he could ensure that the knowledge of what he found, the sheer, terrifying scope of the Tharnak's purpose, did not die with the ironclad. He slammed his palm against the manual override for the transmitter, flooding the ancient system with the remaining power from his suit's reserves, an act that would drain his life support entirely within minutes. He had only enough energy for one burst transmission, one desperate beacon flare. He keyed in the coordinates of the Solitus location, the data he had risked everything for, and appended a single synthesized data packet, the spectral signature of the Tharnak rendezvous signal. It was not a plea for rescue. It was a warning, broadcast via the lowest rung of interstellar communication, intended only for those who dealt in secrets too dirty for the established powers. The transmission bar on the console flickered from 0 to 100% in less than a second, powered by the catastrophic discharge of his suit's dwindling reserves. The light in his visor dimmed significantly as the power drained away. Then the feedback hit. It was not the crushing physical pressure of the jump, nor the searing heat of the engine room. It was an auditory violation. The low, rhythmic pulse of the Tharnak beacon abruptly ceased, replaced by a sound that felt less heard and more implanted directly into Kalen's consciousness. A vast, grinding harmonic, the sound of monumental structures shifting in the void, the noise of something impossibly large beginning to wake up in response to the signal he had just sent. Kalen's internal diagnostics flared red. Suit oxygen reserves critical, primary power failure imminent. He felt the cold deepening, his limbs growing sluggish as the life-giving air hissed away. He had succeeded in broadcasting his discovery to the black market, but in doing so, he had confirmed his position to the custodians. The external proximity sensors, which had been dormant since the Tharnak neutralization of the pirates, flared back to life, not with the distinct signature of the alien cleaners, but with a new massive energy reading. It was approaching from the opposite direction of the original engagement, a single, enormous contact, moving with terrifying inertia, its drive signature matching the ancient warp field Kalen had only just identified in the Tharnak beacon data. The entity that the Tharnak were trying to keep asleep, or perhaps imprisoned, was answering the distress call Kalen had unwittingly sent. Kalen stared at the approaching contact symbol, a vast growing blot against the empty blackness. His last coherent thought was not of his mistakes, but of the chilling, profound realization that the galaxy was far older and far more guarded than humanity had ever dared to imagine. He slumped against the console, the final hiss of his suit's failing environmental systems, the last sound he registered before the darkness, complete and absolute, finally claimed the bridge of the derelict Ironclad. Bevor wir weitermachen, eine kurze Frage. Von wo aus siehst du dir diese Geschichte an? Der Kommandant wäre begeistert zu erfahren, wie weit unsere Flotte bereits vorgedrungen ist. The final agonizing discharge of the auxiliary transmitter sent a spike of raw power through Kalen's suit, momentarily overloading his vision with a blinding white flare that quickly devolved into a throbbing dim crimson wash. The grinding harmonic, the sound of the ancient mechanism reluctantly yielding its slumber, resonated through the hull, a bass note so deep it felt like the internal structure of the ironclad was flexing under unimaginable tension. His breath hitched, the mechanical rasp of the suit's failing scrubber suddenly sounding distant, muted by the overwhelming cosmic scream now echoing in his head. The power drain was instant and terminal. The low, steady thrum that had been his companion since entering engineering died. The magnetic locks holding his magnetic boots stiffened, then failed, leaving him suspended in the near-zero gravity of the crippled engine room, his body drifting slowly toward the blackened wreckage of the primary manifold. The cold, which had been a creeping enemy, became an absolute presence, leaching the residual heat from his core faster than the suit could compensate. He had done the transmission, the secret. The knowledge of the Tharnak quarantine and the location of the awakened entity was out, riding on the backwash of desperation into the grimy underbelly of charted space. It was a transaction paid for in the only currency he had left, his own system failure. The proximity alert on his helmet, miraculously still running on a hardwired backup battery, chirped once, a pathetic, tiny sound that cut through the phantom grinding sound. The new contact, the one answering the distress signal, was closing with a speed that defied conventional propulsion metrics. It wasn't accelerating. It was simply arriving. Kalen forced his gaze toward the main diagnostic viewport, a cracked sheet of reinforced polymer that offered a limited view of the chaos outside the sealed engine compartment. The view confirmed the scale of his final error. The vessel was gargantuan, dwarfing the scattered debris field of the Xylos-packed cruisers that still pulsed faintly with residual plasma burn. It was a monolith of obsidian geometry, angular yet strangely organic, reflecting no light, absorbing every photon cast upon it. It didn't possess the sleek, utilitarian lines of human military engineering, nor the fluid, unsettling grace of the Solitus. This was architecture built for permanence across eons, a structure designed not to travel through space, but to displace it. Kalen wrestled with the unresponsive manual override for the heavy internal engineering hatch, needing to reach the central emergency ballast controls, a mechanism designed for manual venting in case of runaway core meltdowns. A section of the ship the Tharnak sweep had likely ignored due to its extremely low power output. He needed to jettison the entire rear third of the ironclad, including the engine room, turning the rest of his flagship into an inert, drifting hulk that might, just might, be deemed irrelevant by the arriving entity. His armored fingers, numb and slow, finally found the recessed manual lever. He pulled. Nothing happened. The ancient hydraulics, stressed by the massive G-force maneuvers earlier, were locked solid. The inertia of the catastrophe had fused the release mechanism. A new sound permeated the compartment, louder than the grinding harmonic. It was the sound of high-velocity kinetic impact, but muted, as if filtered through layers of dense, resilient atmosphere. The sound of smaller craft engaging the colossal arrival. The Tharnak's enforcers, alerted by their primary's detection of the ironclad's emergency beacon, were engaging the newly awakened threat. Kalen watched the external feed as the three sleek, dark Tharnak interceptors, which had been circling the dead Solitus, suddenly diverted, launching aggressive, needle-like projectiles against the vast incoming bulk. The projectiles detonated against the colossal ship's hull, resulting in dazzling white flashes that illuminated the obsidian geometry for a split second, revealing faint, shimmering energy lines beneath the surface. The reaction from the colossal vessel was swift and brutally efficient. It did not fire weapons. Instead, a wave of pure, invisible energy, not plasma, not radiation, but a pressure wave of structured force, rippled outward. The three Tharnak interceptors vanished. They did not explode or fracture. They simply ceased to exist as coherent objects. Their mass dispersed instantly across the vacuum, leaving behind only a momentary distortion in the background light. The custodians were not interested in a prolonged engagement. They were cleaning up the collateral damage caused by the alarm. Kalen's attention snapped back to the engineering controls. The Tharnak had just demonstrated a level of energy manipulation that rendered his ship's remaining meager defenses pointless. He had seconds before the entity decided the derelict ironclad, or still broadcasting its presence, was also worthy of erasure. He abandoned the hydraulic lever. There was one last, desperate option, something only a long-time mercenary captain intimately familiar with the ship's forgotten quirks would know. The engine room's emergency maintenance access led to the conduit housing for the primary gravity plating, a subsystem entirely decoupled from the main reactor power after the initial failure. It still held a residual charge, enough for a single, powerful electromagnetic pulse designed by the original shipyard technicians to instantly weld loose plasma conduits shut during a minor breach, thus preventing secondary explosions. If he could overload that EMP into the local structure, he might generate enough localized kinetic shock to violently shear the engine compartment free, even if the hydraulics failed. The cost would be devastating. The resulting magnetic surge would wipe every remaining functional piece of sensitive electronics on the surviving command section, including Lyra's life support monitors and Andrel's data logs, ensuring the complete destruction of any evidence of their original mission, even if the black market beacon failed to reach anyone. Total annihilation of data to buy a few more moments of survival. With his remaining strength, Kalen crawled across the cold deck plating, his movements jerky, the suit's internal light flickering violently. He reached the junction box, a heavy metal casing secured by rusted safety clamps. He ripped the clamps free with a grunt of effort that nearly tore his shoulder joint. Inside, the thick cabling glowed faintly, a weak internal current still flowing. He found the manual induction shunt, a bypass built into the wiring to prevent feedback during testing, and yanked it hard, crossing the two primary leads. The effect was instantaneous and violent. A blinding blue-white arc erupted from the junction box, hotter than any welding torch, accompanied by a deafening, high-pitched crack that Kalen felt more than heard through the dense composite of his helmet. The magnetic pulse hammered through the engine room, a focused shock wave designed to rattle metal apart. Kalen was thrown backward against the far bulkhead. The shock wave slammed into the seized ballast controls, and with a sound like a cosmic zipper tearing, the massive coupling bolts connecting the engine section to the rest of the ironclad finally failed. The entire rear section of the dreadnought detached with a violent convulsive lurch. Kalen felt the sudden absence of inertia as his section was flung away from the main hull, tumbling uncontrollably into the void. The emergency severance alarms screaming in a high-pitched electronic shriek that drowned out the Tharnock grinding. He hit the viewport again, his head whipping back. Through the cracked polymer, he saw the main body of the ironclad. The command section containing Lyra and Andrel, drifting slowly away, its running lights extinguished, now just a massive dark tombstone against the distant, indifferent stellar background. The EMP surge had killed everything non-essential. He could only pray that Lyra's independent life support, housed deep in the command tower, had kicked in before the surge hit. He knew, however, that any external monitoring of her status was now gone. He was adrift, accelerating away from the main ship, sealed in the dying engine compartment, watching the monstrous entity approach the inert wreckage of his flagship. The colossal alien vessel made no move toward Kalen's isolated section. It approached the ironclad's main mass with unnerving deliberation. As it drew near, The grinding harmonic intensified until it felt like his skull was being compressed. Kalen saw the colossal hull unfold, not like a ship deploying weapon arrays, but like a gargantuan prehistoric shell cracking open. From the breach, a dull reddish light spilled out, the light of something waking in the absolute dark. It wasn't a fleet emerging, it was singular, monolithic. The Solitis hadn't been the prison key. It had been the silent alarm that brought the jailers only to be ignored when the true inmate awoke. Kalen felt the last dregs of his suit power falter. The air recycling stuttered, replaced by a metallic thin sensation, the vacuum beginning its slow, inevitable victory. He closed his eyes against the crimson glare of the newly awakened horror, realizing the bitter irony. He had sought autonomy through illicit profit, and in his final act, he had managed only to ensure that the information about the ancient threat was loose in the galaxy, while he himself remained isolated, the final forgotten casualty of a conflict he never understood. The colossal shadow of the entity filled his final field of vision, silent now, utterly focused on the prize it had spent millennia waiting for, leaving Kalen Var, the pragmatic mercenary, to fade into the cold history of a failed venture. The shuddering ceased not with a bang, but with the final, definitive cessation of all operational sounds. The high-pitched electronic shriek of the severance alarms died instantly, replaced by a dead, echoing vacuum within the engine module. Kalen's suit battery dipped below critical threshold. The ambient light dimmed from sickly red to a profound, suffocating black. The only sensory input remaining was the subtle, persistent ache in his joints and the metallic, thin taste of recycled oxygen struggling against the growing chill. He floated in the wreckage, a derelict object ejected from a larger, now doomed carcass. The crushing weight of awareness settled upon him before the physical cold could fully seize his extremities. There was no immediate threat to this isolated section. The Tharnak custodians, in their ancient absolute focus, had targeted the command signature, the largest repository of data and energy, the main hull of the ironclad. He had successfully managed to make himself irrelevant, a piece of debris too insignificant to warrant systemic erasure. A small victory, paid for with the potential deaths of his crew. He cycled the emergency optical filters on his helmet, forcing the microscopic charge in the backup battery to activate them for a final scan. Outside, the vast, terrifying tableau remained, the monolithic alien structure now fully revealed in its impossible scale, hovering over the main section of the ironclad. He watched, detached, as the colossal thing began to envelop the command tower. There were no explosions, no dramatic light shows. It was a process of assimilation, of quiet, comprehensive seizure. The Tharnak were not conquerors in the human sense. They were biological processes, ancient immune responses, cleaning up an infection. Kalen thought, momentarily, of Lyra and Andrel. He had gambled their survival on the infinitesimal chance that the independent life support deep within the command block would activate before the EMP surge fried the core regulators. He had sent a warning into the galaxy, a signal that would cause panic in charter outposts and incite paranoia among the remaining mercenary fleets. That message, the nature of the Tharnak, was now loose, but the evidence that he, Kalen Var, had delivered it was sealed inside a tomb drifting toward an eon-spanning sleep. He spent an indeterminate period just observing the colossal structure, allowing the cold to become a familiar companion rather than an active enemy. The initial frantic burst of adrenaline had long since metabolized, leaving behind a deep, pervasive exhaustion that settled in the bone marrow. This was the aftermath of true strategic failure, not defeat in battle, but the realization that the entire framework of the conflict, the corporate maneuvering, the political leverage, the pursuit of ancient technology, was a meaningless dance on the edge of a chasm they hadn't even known existed. They had been fighting over scraps while the gatekeepers of galactic history stirred in their berths. He reached out, his gloved hand brushing against a still warm section of the manifold casing, the last vestige of the ironclad's reactor heart. The surface was smooth, betraying no sign of the stress it had just endured. It was an excellent hull. Pity it had been used as bait. Kalen slowly worked the manual release for his emergency tether, the cable that connected his EVA suit to the engine module's life support umbilical, a system now useless, its connection severed during the violent separation. The release mechanism groaned in protest, but gave way. He was now entirely untethered, a singular fleck of debris drifting away from the main wreckage. He engaged the micromagnets in his boots against the plating of his section, halting his slow, aimless tumble. There was no rescue coming. The packed fleets had scattered like startled vermin the moment the Tharnak threat materialized. The information he sent out was a poisoned dart aimed blindly at the galaxy. It would take years for anyone competent enough to decipher the true threat, and by then the Tharnak would have either secured their territory or moved on, indifferent to the scattered remnants of humanity's ambition. He reviewed the trajectory. His detached engine module was on a slow, decaying orbit toward the outer fringes of the gas giant, far from the immediate vicinity of the Tharnak entity. If he could somehow jury-rig the auxiliary maneuvering thrusters, the ones designed for minute position corrections, not deep space travel, he might achieve escape velocity from the immediate system. It was an insane proposition, requiring the delicate manipulation of fried circuitry in near-absolute zero temperatures, a task even the original engineering team would have refused. But Kalen Var was not interested in survival. He was interested in distance. He closed his eyes again, the exhaustion demanding tribute. He recalled the bridge of the ironclad, the way the tactical display used to hum with green and amber readouts, the constant petty information stream that defined command structure. The smell of ozone and recycled air from Part 1, the scent of manufactured order. That was all gone. Now, there was only the sterile final quiet. He activated the external comm system one last time, not to transmit, but to listen to the background radiation of the universe, the static hiss that underpinned all existence. He listened for the roar of the packed ships, the whine of the Tharnak harmonic, the chatter of Lyra's console. Nothing remained but the distant, impersonal noise of stars cooling down. Kalen Var found the emergency diagnostic toolkit bolted beneath the main pressure valve. A heavy, redundant set of titanium tools he had insisted on keeping after the supply purge. He ignored the throbbing pain in his extremities. The hunt was over. The war had been merely a sideshow to an ancient slumber. He had played his hand, not for victory, but for disruption. He found the bypass shunt for the module's ancient attitude jets. They were inefficient, requiring a manual override that would necessitate stripping the power conduits bare and manually shocking the propellant igniters. It would burn out the system in less than 1 standard minute, but that minute might be enough to propel the coffin section clear of the gas giant's gravitational influence and into the long, dark drift between established jump lanes, a place where information went to die. He pulled the first cable, severing the primary containment field on the auxiliary power cell. The resulting internal arc was minor, a mere flicker in the blackness, but it confirmed the connection was live. He took a deep, shallow breath of the thinning air. There would be no salvage contract, no political amnesty, no veterans' pension. There was only the cold, the drift, and the knowledge he carried. The knowledge that humanity's ceaseless, grasping ambition had finally awakened something that viewed their entire history as an irritating vibration in a very long nap. He connected the final shunt. A violent singular shudder ran through the small module as the attitude jets roared to life. A brief, desperate burst of raw kinetic energy against the vacuum. Then, silence again. Deeper and colder than before, the module was moving away, slowly accelerating into the deep black. He could no longer see the main bulk of the ironclad. The shadow of the Tharnak monolith was the only landmark remaining. He had bought himself exile, not freedom. Kalen leaned his helmeted head back against the cold plating, allowing his exhausted muscles to relax their desperate tension. The deep, pervasive cold was beginning to feel oddly comfortable, a final, logical end to a messy, unprofitable career. He watched the faint, distant light of the gas giant shrink in the viewport, realizing that the smell he remembered from the bridge in Part 1, that sharp, stale scent of recycled sweat, was the smell of all human endeavors, the unavoidable residue of too much effort exerted in a confined space. He was alone now, drifting in a tin can powered by a final, cynical impulse. The galaxy was immense, and the Tharnak were older than civilization itself. He had not saved humanity. He had merely delayed its next inevitable, self-inflicted catastrophe by broadcasting a warning that few would believe and fewer still would heed. The cold seeped into his suit's insulation, an absolute finality that no amount of plasma or political maneuvering could ward off. The universe did not care for objectives, only for entropy. Wenn dir diese Mission gefallen hat, schließe dich unserer Crew an, abonniere den Kanal und teile diese Episode mit jemandem, der Science Fiction liebt. Jedes neue Crewmitglied stärkt unsere Flotte und hält diese Geschichten im ganzen Universum lebendig.